right, what's up? Welcome to the mystery religion known as Dialectical Materialism. And you might think, how could this man be so insane, so foolish? Materialism is not religious. It's purely scientific. Purely scientific. Indeed, that is what Marxism claimed to be as it progressed from the earlier revolutionary movements of the time of the French Revolution, and even before that, from the figures of Saint-Simon, Saint-Just, and Buonarroti and Weishaupt. So we'll be going into some history here, going back to some of the revolutionary figures that precede Marx, even back to the Renaissance period, the magic of the Renaissance period, and some of the Hermeticists that precede and influence Marx. And you say, wait a minute, how could Hermeticists influence Karl Marx? Because Marx was an atheist. It's just not possible. Right, but you see the Hermeticists influence one of the most important influences on Marx, and that's Hegel. So we're going to be talking about some of Hegel's process philosophy, the mystical religion of process, the worship of dialectical process itself. And the worship of dialectical process, or the attributing to dialectical process of theological and religious intentionality and attributes, is not new to Hegel or the Hermeticists of that period prior to Hegel and the secret societies that people in the Prussian aristocracy were members of. This also spills over into ancient philosophy, where the original ideas of Marxism find their roots, particularly in the famous figures of the pre-Socratics and Plato. Now, I've covered the predecessors to Marxism and socialism and Platonism many, many times. So we're not going to focus on Plato. We're going to focus on pre-Socratic ideology, particularly the figure of Heraclitus. And the reason that we want to talk about Heraclitus is that he has a specific presupposition about flux. All reality is essentially flux for Heraclitus. And if you don't know, I did teach a course going through the history of Western philosophy, and we began with the pre-Socratics, and that's a 30-plus hour course, which you can purchase right there if you're interested, from Richard Grove's Autonomy Agora Marketplace, together with the Q&As and all of that. It comes to close to 40 hours of information. But we begin the talk with how Western philosophy is really rooted in the notion of dialectics. And it goes back older. It's prior to what we call Western philosophy, usually beginning with the Greeks, because you can go back to ancient Aryan Hindu philosophy, you can go back to ancient Babylonian philosophy, you can go back to ancient Egyptian philosophy. They had very similar approaches, usually the assumptions of total monism or total dualism. That's most world religions and ancient religions, especially Far Eastern religions. They typically fall over into either being monistic or dualistic. And that's true for the irreligious pre-Socratic philosophers. While the pre-Socratics, you could say that they were a kind of proto-atheist, they still attributed magical powers to matter. Matter does things that God could do. Matter comes to be out of nothing, or has always eternally existed, and so it has a kind of eternality, and the universe is eternal, right? Eternal return. These ideas are present, for example, in Plato. Plato, I would argue, is a mystical, initiatory, theological philosophy. But predecessors to Plato amongst the pre-Socratics, who were usually consumed with questions of grand narrative. So with the pre-Socratics, Parmenides, right, with Heraclitus, Anaximander, all these different characters, they were concerned with figuring out what is the overriding ultimate force, power, or organizing principle that explains all reality. And so, for example, in Heraclitus, the idea is that all reality fundamentally just is flux. It is change. The only permanence is change. That would be a very Heraclitean dictum. So we'll look at this forerunner because, of course, when we get to people like Hegel, who will influence Marx, because early Marx joins the young Hegelians, we're going to see that dialectical process philosophy is the root, the presupposition, the starting point of the entire system. And Marxism, much like Hegelianism, is what we call a system-building project. It's not concerned with metaphysics, even though it uses metaphysical claims, metaphysical argumentation, presupposes metaphysics all over the place. It contradicts itself by deriding and rejecting metaphysics as a pre-Enlightenment fiction/fantasy. But just because we call something fiction or fantasy doesn't make it so. And so when we attribute universal claims to all reality, like that all reality is matter, if we're empiricists, and of course pretty much all of the Marxists are empiricists, you don't have access to that. You can't even know that. It's an unjustified claim. And so they would do well to read a little bit of Hume. Now, Lenin did read Hume, and we're going to look at some of Lenin's comments on Hume and Feuerbach when Lenin attempts to address this question, because Lenin doesn't believe in, apparently, or so he claims, total relativism. He believes that there is objective truth. Objective truth is objective reality, which is simply matter, which is simply the external material world is, for Lenin, truth itself. That's the highest epistemic principle. Now, that's a metaphysical claim at the same time as we're dispensing with metaphysics. So let's look at Heraclitus first. We're going to rewind all the way back to 500 BCE, and we're going to notice the presuppositions of this worldview and of this system. And it doesn't really matter ultimately which of the various Marxist traditions and schools and schisms we look at, because all of the Marxist schools and schisms are going to be predicated on dialectical materialism. And it doesn't matter if they want to believe in a brute, reductionist, crude materialism, or if they want to have some kind of so-called belief in immaterial realities. The question is, that's just rescuing the system without a justification for how there are immaterial realities. So as we'll see, it doesn't matter what you claim your position is. The question is, why should we believe that? And just like Thomas and just like so many people in weird, ridiculous systems, they think that stating what their system is constitutes the argument. We don't want to know what your system is. We know what your system is. But we want to know why we're supposed to believe that's the case. Why ought we believe that? What are the good reasons? Not any reasons. The good reasons to believe that we should not trust metaphysics as we make metaphysical claims about all reality being matter, or all reality being matter in some form of ideas. If all reality is matter, where do ideas come from? What are ideas? What is the faculty that you're calling the mind or the reasoning faculty, if everything is reducible to pure flux? All reductionist systems, even if they want to have a place for ideas or a form of idealism, become irrational and incoherent because they're contradicting themselves. But as we're going to see, in Marxism, it's okay to contradict. In fact, the root of the system is the acceptance of contradictions, because contradictions are the furtherance of Marxism. That's called Praxis. Marxism is not a system where you sit around and theorize. You must take action. Praxis is the essence of Marxism, because Marxism is predicated on rejecting theory or pure theory. Philosophy for the Marxists is theorizing, sitting around speculating. True system action, true praxis, is rejecting philosophy and acting in the world. To do what? To contradict, to struggle, to oppose, to cause struggle, because struggle is the mystical process by which the dialectic is furthered, so that the process itself, which is the process, is the religion. It is the God figure. Dialectical oppositions, and that's why they love, for example, Darwinism. Darwinism is survival of the fittest. It is the biological, natural imperative to engage in conflict for the purpose of evolution in the species to produce the fitter models, so to speak. That is why Marx, for example, as he got more mature, as he developed and wrote Das Kapital, he dedicated it to Darwin, because he saw, or he believed his system to be the perfect, pure science of praxeology, of human action in the world, of human sociology, which is not even developed yet, but will eventually develop out of socialism. Socialist Marxists will develop the discipline eventually of sociology via actually the Rockefeller-funded University of Chicago. But it actually has its predecessors in people like Saint-Simon, as we'll see, and Auguste Comte, the socialists of France prior to and at the time of Marx in the 1800s. But let's understand this mystical dialectical material process. And why do I call it mystical? Well, when we look at Hegel, we're going to understand that it's mystical. But when we go to Marx, as everyone probably knows, hopefully, Marx turns Hegel on his head. And Marx will be influenced by not just Hegel, but also a couple other figures like Saint-Simon and like Feuerbach. So Saint-Simon, Hegel, and Feuerbach are the three key influences on early young Marx, when Marx is a member of the young Hegelians. Later on, Marx will incorporate other influences like Darwin. But when we think about Hegel, we have to remember that Hegel has multiple influences as well that are not restricted to Plato or dialecticians of the ancient Greek world like Heraclitus, but certain Renaissance Hermetic figures and Kabbalists who will be a crucial influence on the figure of Hegel. And I'll list some of those figures here in a moment when we get to looking at a little bit of Hegel. And this will be coming from the excellent academic text, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, by Dr. Alexander McGee from Long Island University. This is a pretty well-known, well, I guess in Hegelian studies it's a well-known book, but not many people have actually read this book. But the book goes on to demonstrate the various Rosicrucian secret society influences on the figure of Hegel when developing his kind of alchemical philosophy. But let's go all the way back to Heraclitus. Heraclitus flourished around 500 BCE, and he is the critic of his predecessors and contemporaries for failing to see the unity of all experience. And so we have an attempt at a monistic perspective. What is monism? Monism is the idea that all reality is one thing. It could be one thing in different sense. It could be matter. All reality is that one thing that is matter. It could be ideas. All reality is that one thing that is ultimately just an idea. And so Platonism, for example, is an idealist philosophy that you could argue is ultimately monistic. You might also argue that perhaps Platonism is dualistic. Zoroastrianism, right? That's a religion, or various Gnostic groups. Those are religious structures and narratives that are basically dualistic, in that all reality is fundamentally two types of things: God versus matter, light versus dark, etc. Those are dualistic approaches. But when we come to the character of Heraclitus, he is a monistic philosopher. All reality is what? What is that one big thing? It is logos. But what for him is logos? Well, in one sense, he says opposites are necessary for life. They are like a unified system of balanced exchanges. The world itself consists of law-like interchanges of elements. And so if you go back to Empedocles and the pre-Socratics, they will list out the four elements and then perhaps ether as the fifth element. And these elements are always kind of colliding and bumping and causing and doing different things and producing different things, right? Men and women come together, they produce a kid. Fire comes together with water and it produces heat, it produces steam, right? The water evaporates. And so all of life is characterized, did you notice that, as oppositional necessity. Opposites are necessary for life. Day, night, dark, light, white, black, male, female, cold, hot, etc. But it is a unified, law-like interchange of this perpetual flux. And what is the best symbol of this for Heraclitus? Fire. Why fire? Because fire is hot. It is always moving. It is ultimately constantly changing. And the mystico-metaphysical religious significance here is that all of reality, since it is supposedly just atoms and molecules bumping around and moving, all reality is fundamentally, ultimately pure flux. Again, coming back to Heraclitus. Now, keep in mind that the usage of fire there is relevant because fire is going to be a perpetual symbol that Marxist socialist revolutionaries throughout the later centuries post-Enlightenment will use as their chief symbol. In fact, they will actually hearken back to not just Heraclitus, but even to the ancient Zoroastrians in the character of Weishaupt, to point out that because the Zoroastrians worshipped fire as this revolutionary principle, furthering the duality, right? Because there's always this interchange. What is it that symbolizes the constant flux, the constant change? Again, fire, which is perpetually always in motion and movement. Thus, and we will look at this as one of our key source texts for this discussion, the classic book by James Billington, Fire in the Minds of Men, Origins of the Revolutionary Faith. Not an accident that he titled his book Fire in the Minds of Men, because the revolutionary philosophy, all the way back to these guys, is symbolized by fire. And when we look to the predecessors to the French Revolution, the characters of Buonarroti and Adam Weishaupt, not talking about conspiracy theories, but the actual history of Adam Weishaupt, he will utilize Pythagorean, Zoroastrian, and Heraclitean symbology for his communistic philosophy. For those that don't know, Adam Weishaupt was a communist prior to Karl Marx. And for those that don't know, prior to Adam Weishaupt, Pythagoras and Plato were communists prior to Karl Marx. And it's not even disputed when you get into the academic literature on this. I had undergrad and grad classes where we covered the history of the French Revolution through many academic texts. So I know this history very well. But keep in mind that James Billington is not a conspiracy theorist. Billington was a believer in the revolutionary philosophy. In fact, he was the Librarian of Congress. And so this is a historical political science history text by the Librarian of Congress. It is a famous academic text. It is not a conspiracy text. And of course, being at the Library of Congress, James Billington, of course, favors the American Girondin side of the revolution over the Jacobin side. But nevertheless, he still gives a lot of credence and honor and obeisance to the revolutionary communist ethos of the Jacobins, who were the radical communists following Weishaupt in the French Revolution. In other words, the Jacobins believed in no private property. Your wife is my wife. We share all things in common. Literal communists. Men and women are completely equal. Whereas the Girondins were the more, quote, conservative revolutionaries who believed in private property, who believed in distinctions between genders, etc. Doesn't mean that they're not still revolutionary philosophers. They were, right? The merchant class, the nobility in the French Revolution, the Lafayettes, these kinds of characters, they were the Girondins. They believed in right-wing revolution. So ever since the French Revolution, we have been stuck in a choice between two forms of revolutionary philosophy. Do you want communism, socialism of the Jacobin sort and the Marxist sort, or do you want revolutionary philosophy of the American founding fathers sort? That's really all that's offered to you in the modern world since the French Revolution. There's really no other options. And yes, I understand that laissez-faire economics is just a older form of revolution, merchant class revolutionary philosophy of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Locke. But that also is an Anglo-empiricist revolutionary Enlightenment philosophy that's just the dialectical opposition to the socialism of that time. And yes, there were socialisms all the way back to the ancient world. Again, going back to figures like Pythagoras and Plato. Plato's book is called The Republic. And in The Republic, the guardian class in particular holds all things in common. And so you have a proto-communism in the ideal republic of Plato. Eventually this gets a little bit modified by later Plato in the Laws, where he erects a secret society that governs the what he calls Magnesia, the new form of the republic. In Magnesia, it's governed by an intelligence operative secret society group called the Council of Night. And so it doesn't really change a whole lot, except that you have a de-emphasizing of the philosopher king, and it's more so run by a council of wise oligarchs or Olympians. Basically the way we're governed nowadays, with a Kissinger, a Brzezinski, a coalition of oligarchs and councils and steering committees, really modeled, I would say, you could argue probably on the basis of Plato's later work, The Laws of Magnesia. But regardless, there's still proto-communism in Plato's Republic, because the guardian class has all things in common, including wives and children. So back to Heraclitus. For Heraclitus, notice that the logos here is not what we think of in Orthodox Christianity or in John 1's sense of the logos. So notice how we have to be careful how we define words, right? Logos doesn't mean the same thing in every philosopher and across every system. That's called the word concept fallacy. And a lot of Roman Catholics trade on this bait and switch argument, where they will say, look, all the philosophers are talking about logos. That's what John means in John 1. Well, there might be some overlap, but that doesn't mean that they mean the same thing. For example, Heraclitus's logos is an all-pervading monistic force. It is the composite totality of all of reality that is the logos in flux, in movement, and in process. Okay, we're not pantheists. Jesus is not the world of flux. Jesus, the logos, is the second person of the Godhead. That is not what Heraclitus is teaching. So there's not the same referent between Heraclitus's logos and John's logos in John 1. Roman Catholics, can you understand this? Natural theology, can you understand this? There are different references there. Now, it is true that what Greek philosophers were seeking for when they talked about the all-pervading idea of logos ultimately is grasping in the dark for the person of Christ. But it is not grasping in the dark for generic monad theism. There is no generic theism. There is only triad, and the energies of God are only manifested in a triadic mode, as is it Losky or Manzarides argues. I think it's Manzarides. The world is not to be identified in any particular substance, but with ongoing process governed by, quote, law of change. Now, let's presupp this right from the outset, because this presuppositional critique will apply to every process philosophy system out there. Very easy to refute this. Notice the fundamental law, the unchanging, supposedly non-material principle, the starting point, the first principle of this system is the law. Now, law cannot be reduced to matter here. It must be an existing metaphysical truth principle that is immaterial and non-variant to be a law. Otherwise, it's not a law. The law is that all of reality is change. All of reality is subject to ongoing process. Number one, it's a universal claim. So how do we know that Heraclitus knows this? What is the justification epistemically for saying all of reality is flux? Second, if all reality is flux, then the proposition all reality is flux is no longer true and must also be subject to flux. Very simple presuppositional critique of the first principle of Heraclitianism and all dialectical philosophy. maybe accepting Hegel and a few of the German idealists who might not believe that all reality is flux. They will have probably some place for the absolute or the universal. Certainly, for example, Plato wouldn't believe that all reality is flux, right? Plato would disagree with this. In fact, Plato and Aristotle are trying to resolve the questions of the pre-Socratics. Questions like the one and the many. Questions like, what is the fundamental nature of all that exists? Is it fire? Is it water? Is it flux? Is it permanence? Parmenides, Zeno, all these guys trying to answer this question. Plato and Aristotle will also try to deal with a pre-Socratic question known as the question of identity or change over time. Many of the pre-Socratics were preoccupied with this metaphysical question. And Aristotle and Plato both attempt to give answers to that. Aristotle's causes are his answer to the pre-Socratic question of identity through change or identity over time. That's the whole point, the whole origin of Aristotle's causes. So Heraclitus is the first Western philosopher to go beyond physical theory in search of metaphysical foundations and moral applications. So notice that the argument that all reality is process is a metaphysical claim. And it doesn't matter whether you think that all reality is ideas or all reality is matter. When you say all reality is matter, that's a metaphysical claim. And ontology is a branch of metaphysics. Against all the Marxists who had no clue what I was talking about the other day. Literally no knowledge of philosophy at all. Trying to debate, no clue what these words mean, what a metaphysical or ontological claim is. And Heraclitus lived in Ephesus on the Ionian coast of Asia Minor, not far from Miletus, the birthplace of philosophy. We know nothing about his life other than that it can be gleaned from his own statements. For all ancient biographies of him consist of nothing more than inferences of imaginary constructions based on what he said. Plato thought he wrote after Parmenides, but perhaps it is more likely that he wrote before Parmenides. He is criticized by name by important thinkers with whom he disagrees, although he doesn't mention Parmenides. Parmenides argued, contrary to Heraclitus, that all reality is flux, change is an illusion. Parmenides is the opposite of Heraclitus. Heraclitus says, no, you are wrong. All reality is flux, not permanence. So you have it backwards. Dialectical opposition, you see. Later philosophers then attempt to solve this dialectical ideological conflict by a synthesis. This will be part of the reason why later process philosophers like Hegel argue that it's not just matter that's in motion, it's also ideas, and ultimately for Hegel, all reality is ideas. Ideas and their exchange are producing a synthesis, which is a gradual upward movement and ascent of history to become pure spirit. That's the Hegelian view. That's the omega point. That's the cunning of reason and all the stuff that Hegel talked about. Now, again, that's going to be all this will be very relevant for Karl Marx. So we can't understand Marx until we understand these things first. And it's not controversial. I studied under Marxists in college, trained under Frankfurt School people. So my professor, my graduate and undergraduate advisor in philosophy, trained under his advisor was under Habermas. So I have direct descent from Frankfurt School. I make that joke, but I'm also not joking. But I have Marxist-Stalic succession through studying under people who studied under Habermas. So that doesn't mean that my arguments are correct. I'm just saying that that's my pedigree. That's my lineage in terms of academic study. I studied a lot of Marxism in college and in grad school. That does not make me a Marxist expert. I do not care that much about Marxism to become a Marxist expert. But I guarantee you, compared to 99% of internet Marxists, I know way more Marxism and have studied way more Marxist texts, especially from Horkheimer, Adorno, Habermas, and these figures out of the critical school, than any of these other goobers. I also understand that the Frankfurt School is not identical to early Marx, and it's not identical to Soviet bloc Marxism. I'm well aware of all of these distinctions and schisms within the religion known as Marxism. Yes, exactly. Marxism is a religion with high priests, mystical texts, mystical jargon, an inner core elite, a hierarchy, saints like Dzerzhinsky, who was considered the pure flame, the saint of Marxists. He was the great Marxist martyr, you could say, because supposedly he was willing to give everything to the revolution, is the philosophy of Dzerzhinsky. The doctrine of flux and the unity of opposites. According to Plato and Aristotle, Heraclitus believed extreme views that led to logical incoherence. Everything is constantly changing, and opposites are actually identical, so that everything is and is not at the same time. In other words, universal flux and the identity of opposites entail a denial of the law of non-contradiction. Now, this, you'll notice, is absolutely applicable to Marxism, because Marxism's praxeology necessitates the acceptance of contradictions, you see. This is what I was trying to illustrate, and a lot of people don't know this. The reason that you can't have a debate with a Marxist is because Marxists don't have the same presuppositions about what laws of history, laws of logic, and facts are. They're not what you think they are. All of these things are merely tools in the toolkit to engage in revolutionary action. You're not entering into a debate with a committed, serious Marxist to figure out the truth. For them, debate is an action of praxis by which they contradict, engage in power relations to further the dialectic, to oppose you at all costs, and to oppose each other. In fact, Marxism necessitates that each generation of Marxists oppose the previous generation of Marxists. And until you understand that, you will never understand this system. You will be thinking that you're figuring out some law of history, some deterministic, scientific structure of the phases of history. And that's not what Marxism is. Until you realize that Marx intentionally and had no problem contradicting himself and modifying the system and doing things that contradicted it, it will never make sense to you. But notice the statement there. Everything is flux and changing. Opposites are identical. The higher level Marxists even discuss this and talk about it, because I believe Marxism was actually run out of London and New York. And so when we go to the higher level Marxists like H.G. Wells can say monopoly capitalism is no different than Marxism, Leninism, Trotskyism, because opposites are ultimately identical and they're all moving towards the synthesis. So capitalism must clash with Marxism, communism. But the product is not either one. The product is the synthesis. The product is Klaus, not Stalin, not Tiny Mustache Man. Those are all just lower level dialectical manifestations. And not even Dave Rockefeller and his moneyed elite. Until you understand this and the law of opposites and the contradictions and the embracing of contradiction for the purpose of embracing the dialectic and the philosophy of process, you cannot understand the system. You will be arguing against nothing, pointlessness, straw men, red herrings. And all of the Marxists who don't understand this, who are just dumb ideologues and low IQ dupes, college goobers, they are also dupes of this, trapped in the dialectic. All this, by the way, is actually also outlined in the Rakovsky interrogation. Interesting. Rakovsky says everything that I'm saying. Interesting. Wonder why that would be. Why would he say everything I'm saying? Now, I didn't come to this through reading the Rakovsky interrogation. I came to this through a lot of years of reading and studying under Marxists. And yet the famous NKVD interrogation of the Trotskyite Christian Rakovsky has Rakovsky stating everything that I'm telling you. There is the link to the Rakovsky interrogation if you want to go down that rabbit hole. So that's enough with Heraclitus, because I think we can see the fundamental ideas in Heraclitus of revolutionary metaphysics, right? Everything is in flux. Now, again, he's still couched within the idea of explaining a universal metaphysical truth, right? So it's not until we get post-Enlightenment where we get supposedly the rejection of metaphysics after David Hume and after Immanuel Kant that later Marxists will then begin to say we are anti-metaphysics, even though it's contradictory, because they affirm metaphysics every time they talk about states of reality, about universal claims, about what is or is not the case. Is and is not are statements of existence. Those are predicates of what exists and what does not exist. Materialism is the case. That's a metaphysical statement. It's an ontological statement, to be more precise, because it's a statement of what being is. What is the type of being of which all things exist? It is matter, they say. Matter is the fundamental of all existence. So even though they might give credence to ideas, in my view, that's just a contradiction. Okay, you can't give an account for ideas. You realize that your system needs ideas to be coherent, and it also needs things like laws. But you have a contradiction in the system whereby you don't have an account for a justification for the belief in ideas or in laws of logic. Thus, they then revert to embracing contradictions, and they make the system unfalsifiable, because they will say if you are engaged in arguing against them, you are arguing from the position of bourgeoisie. So in other words, every argument against Marxism is already immediately invalidated because it comes from a bourgeois opposition to Marxism. So it's an unfalsifiable system, you see. And that, by the way, is a common weak point, a crack in any so-called system, right? Because the system has to, it's like much like the papacy. You can't argue against the papacy because the papacy is infallible. Well, what about all the time was where it contradicts and it's no longer teaching correctly and Francis is teaching heresy? Oh, well, those were never infallible declarations, you see. So it's a ever-moving goalpost, which then makes the system unfalsifiable. But unfalsifiable systems are usually false systems. They're always false systems. So there we have the key figure of Heraclitus. And then we want to move up to later on this great book that is very important for Orthodox theology, because you might not know that the Orthodox, especially in Byzantium, shut down the Platonic academies, right? Aristotle kind of became the philosopher, so to speak, of apodictic logic. Palamas writes the apodictic treatise on the Holy Spirit, accepting a lot of the basic principles of Aristotelian logic. That's not to say that there weren't some Neoplatonic influences on St. Maximus or on Palamas, even when it came to the Logi. But when it came to the Platonic Academy, Byzantium shut it down. However, it gets revived. And when it was shut down in Byzantium, is actually underground for many, many years. And one of the key figures in the underground Platonic Academy was Gemistos Plethon. Plethon was interesting because he was a unique atheist Platonist. So you might think, well, wait a minute, how could you be atheist Platonist? Well, Plethon saw the ideas of Plato not as existing in a transcendent realm, but really as symbolic of this realm, or patterns and structures of this realm. And so there's not a personal God ultimately that unifies and gives meaning to reality in Plethon's system. For Plethon, atheistic Platonism is the ultimate answer. And if I recall, I think Plethon also tried to give place to process and change, because in Platonism there's always a never-ending question about how to give an account for change, right? That's one of the reasons Aristotle disagreed with Plato. There was many others, but one reason was that Aristotle didn't believe that Plato had a good account for change, right? He didn't have a good account for the relationship of the realm of the ideas to the realm of the here and the now, which is change and flux. And so this is partly what motivates Aristotle's response to both the pre-Socratics and to Plato. So in Byzantium, this figure of Plethon left scholars of Platonism puzzled as they struggled to understand the project described in his big treatise, the Nomoi. It entailed abandoning Christian orthodoxy and to revive the ancient pagan notions that were present in Plato. The only copy of this work was burned by Patriarch Gennadios Scholarius, who kept some excerpts to prove that he was justified in destroying it. After the publication, fragments survived, translated by Charles Alexander in 1858. A variety of different interpretations of Plethon's Platonism have been suggested, ranging from the idea that he was the leader of a pagan cell operating in the Peloponnese, and to the idea that he was, this is his secret society. A whole story of apostasy from Christian orthodoxy, amongst other philosophers. They argue that the background of these scholarly impasse, Sinisioglu's book tackles the problem of making sense of Plethon's pagan Platonism from the point of view of the history of ideas. It explores the intellectual history of the 14th century as the current context in which Plethon's philosophy has been understood. As a result, what he offers is not a general introduction, but rather a historical survey of this enigmatic figure. The result is a learned and stimulating book. Okay, yeah, we got it. The book is organized into various parts, and here's the key point where it gets to the end. Now notice underground Platonism, right, as a sort of secret society throughout Byzantium. I want to get you to the end because the ultimate thesis of the book vindicates a lot of what I've talked about, and it vindicates what's in this book. And this is the idea that, I don't know if this is just somebody's analysis of the book, but the Platonic atheism influences Spinoza, and that also influences the Illuminists of the time period that we're talking about, this time period. So there's a direct ideological lineage from Plethon's atheistic Platonism to Spinoza and to Weishaupt in those characters. And Sinisioglu even says that. He says that the Illuminists of the Weishaupt era are influenced by this philosophy. So if you've not read it, I highly recommend the excellent book, very well documented Cambridge production, Radical Platonism in Byzantium, Utopia and Gemistos Plethon by Nikitas Sinisioglu. So that's, you see how we're tracing this up through, and by the way, for those that don't know also, the chief philosophical ideological opposition to the church fathers throughout the first 7 ecumenical councils is Greek Hellenic dialectics. Every one of the ecumenical councils is battling various dialectical argumentation. Either this or that. Either Jesus is human or he's divine. Either the Trinity is a Unitarian thing or it's tritheism. Either Jesus is, his will is overtaken by the divinity or he's subsumed into the divinity. It's either or, it's dialectics constantly. Because Greek philosophy, as we saw with Heraclitus, is premised on the necessity of opposites. The necessity of opposites. Orthodox Christianity and Orthodox philosophy is premised on the rejection of metaphysical dialectical oppositions. There are oppositions in nature, sure. But it's not a necessary opposition, number one, because this world is fallen. So you would only take these things to be natural if you didn't believe in the fall. But our world is not natural. It is in a degraded or unnatural state because of the fall. Nature is still good, but as Paul says in Romans 8, it is in bondage to corruption until the eschaton. But regardless, the state that we're in now, although not inherently evil, is not itself the ideal state. It's not the Edenic state. It's not what we have in the eschaton, right? And so all of Western philosophy is premised on dialectics. And this is one of the key elements that distinguishes Orthodox Christianity from all the other philosophies. And I would argue even Far Eastern philosophies. Far Eastern philosophies are also enmeshed in dialectics. Either or. All reality is one thing, or it's two things, or it's no thing. Those are all dialectics. And whenever I talk about this, people don't know what I'm talking about, and they get confused. They don't know what they think dialectics is the same thing as dialectical method. No. That's pedagogy. That's teaching. Okay, that's question and answer back and forth. Nothing wrong with that. That's just classic ways to teach people. The Dialectic method. I'm talking about metaphysical dialectics, that all reality is fundamentally constantly flux and struggle, strife, and emotion. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is objectively true or in permanence or in stasis other than what the party dictates, you see. So in this way, it's very similar to the metaphysical discussion that O'Brien says to Winston in the metaphysics debate in 1984. So you said, but wait a minute. Lenin argues for objective truth. He doesn't think that everything is flux and sophistry. Yeah, but that's just contradicting. And the question is not, does he think that or does he say that? The question is that consistent with the rest of what he says? No, it's not, right? So again, just like Thomists, they think that stating the position is an argument. Likewise, Marxists, let me state what Lenin's positions are. As if the question is, what is the position? The question is the position true? Is it coherent? Are there good reasons to believe it? People don't even know the difference between stating a position and arguing for the position. What is your position versus why should we believe the position? It should be pretty obvious. It's a really basic thing, and people don't know what this is. They're lost. So I've seen hundreds of comments over the past few days as a result of all this Marxist jibber jabber. And I've not seen but maybe one or two of the entire crowd of them even understand the difference between stating a position and explaining why we should believe that position. I mean, it's like, it's not hard. Yeah, reality is reality. Exactly. Just what T-Jump said. All right, so we've gotten to Heraclitus, we've gotten to Plethon, we've gotten up into the Enlightenment figures. Now we're going to take a look at the Renaissance and Hermeticist figures. This is also, Plethon's stuff will influence a lot of these Renaissance figures as well. So Plethon's era is 1355 to 1452. When Byzantium falls, a lot of this ideological heritage goes to places like, you got it, Renaissance Italy. Not just Renaissance Italy, it also goes throughout Europe we get Marsilio Ficino, we get the Medicis, we get the Florentine revival of Neoplatonism, which undergirds the Renaissance. So next we're going to look at this book, Hegel and Hermeticism, because, and I think this, I can't remember if he argues that this is like a Hegelian drawing, right? This is Hegel's drawing of how the dialectic of the synthesis works. And you can see that it is an actual occult drawing, right? So it's like triangles on top of triangles on top of triangles, right? This is the dialectical process of thesis, antithesis producing the synthesis. And people have tried to argue with me over the years that that's not what Hegel says. He don't really teach that. No, Hegelian philosophers show that is what he says, and that is what I had Hegel classes, and all my professors told me that that's what Hegel teaches. And I'm talking about people who studied under Marxist Hegelians. So again, none of these people. So internet goobers that are 20 years old know more than the PhDs in Hegel. My undergrad professor wrote his thesis on Hegel and Marx. So my advisor studied under the guy who studied under Habermas, writes his PhD thesis on Hegel. I think he would know what Hegel teaches. All right. So there you see the triadic thesis structure. And note that this has nothing to do with the Christian Trinity. It's another example of why you can't do thesis and why you can't do a word concept fallacy here. Because Hegel says, well, I believe in the Trinity. And then you ask Hegel what the Trinity is, and it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Right? I mean, Hegel's Trinity is immanentized into the world historical process. Okay? That's Hegel's Trinity. God is the absolute of all historical process in Hegel. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, moving to the omega point, moving to the absolute, where everything becomes absolute spirit. So let's look at some of these figures that influenced Hegel, and we're going to understand why this is such a weird esoteric philosophy. By the way, if you want to support the show, you can via the Super Chat function right there. Super Chats are done via Streamlabs. And I'm giving you the whole historical, ideological drift, the background to understanding Marxism and socialism, which cannot be understood without understanding first Hegel, Hegel's influences, and then the Hermetic and ancient Hellenic pre-Socratic influences. There's really, literally no other way to understand Marxism. And of course, none of the other, like when libertarians are out there critiquing, they don't, not every libertarian. I think Dr. James Lindsay does have a good basic idea of what we're talking about today. He's correct. But most of the libertarian response to Marxism is super low tier. They don't know any of this stuff. Because if they did know this, they would know that their philosophy is also part of that dialectic. So again, the key here is rejecting of all the dialectics. And every time I say that, people have no idea what I'm talking about. They're just lost. It's like, what does that mean? What do you mean? So here we have, so I don't believe that money is evil, right? The love of money is evil, not money. So you can get out of here. Don't have any interest in talking to you. If you want to support the show, you can via Streamlabs. So again, thank you for the super chats that we got last night. We got one so far. So I'll read those perhaps here in a bit. So in Dr. McGee's text, he goes into the historical influences on Hegel from the esoteric tradition. And we're going to name some of these figures. The first, he calls the early Hermeticists that had an influence, such as the Neoplatonic philosophers. Hegel admired Proclus quite a bit, so he was influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy. I think that's pretty obvious, pretty well known. Another famous mystic from that time period was Meister Eckhart. Eckhart was a mystic in Gotha about 1260. He died in 1327. No one has demonstrated the direct Hermetic influence on Eckhart, but his thought exhibits certainly Hermetic influences co-opted out of German Hermeticists in later times. Eckhart's significance for German philosophy and intellectual culture cannot be overestimated. In fact, Eckhart dominates for many centuries German mystical philosophy afterwards, and certainly the apophatic and I would argue that Eckhart's a manifestation of Roman Catholic theological inadequacies of that time, because you'll notice that it's a Trinitarian heresy in Eckhart. Eckhart preached that just as the Son requires the Father to give him existence, so the Father is not Father without the Son. Thus, God would not be God without the created order. So we have the problem of modal collapse and the notion of creation as a necessity and not ex nihilo. That always results out of absolute divine simplicity problems in the West. So filioque, which is again the mystical filioque of Plotinus's Aeneads is what underlies Eckhart. God would not be God without creation. God must create to actualize who he is. This is actually an Aristotelian argument. This is why Basil calls Aristotle a dyad heretic. This is one of the most innovative of Eckhart's Hermetica. Just as in Hegel, more than 500 years later, God the Father is conceived of as an abstract and incomplete. The nature or creation is the Son. The Son is an emanation that returns to the Father, and thus the Holy Spirit, as in Hegel, is mankind. So again, what is Hegelianism? Immanentized pantheism. It's Neoplatonism, pantheized. Nicholas of Cusa, again, the famous Hermeticist, who, on the basis of the Filioque, argued that there was an internal process philosophy going on in God. And Nicholas of Cusa, by the way, influences not just German idealism, but also Leibniz's monads. Creation is a necessity in Nicholas of Cusa because Nicholas of Cusa identifies nature and person, much the same way that people like Aquinas do. Now, wait a minute. You're lying. Aquinas believes in creation ex nihilo. Yeah, that's called a contradiction. So, collapsing nature into person, collapsing will and energy into essence, and then saying that you believe in creation ex nihilo does not believe that you consistently believe it. Does not mean you consistently believe in it. It just means you contradict. Other Renaissance Neoplatonists had a tremendous influence on Hegel, particularly Jacob Boehme, and the overlaps with Kabbalism. Pico della Mirandola, Johann Reuchlin, Cornelius Agrippa, who was a famous Renaissance magus, and Giordano Bruno, all have a tremendous influence on the figure of Hegel and his process philosophy. For Boehme and many of these characters, logos is not the second person of the Godhead. As with Gnostic conceptions of the logos, Jacob Boehme's wisdom or logos is conceived of as an active. It is the source of the further specifications of God's corporeality. For Boehme, God's wisdom or logos is conceived of as female. It's metaphorically female. So here we have Sophia philosophy of Bulgakov already in Jacob Boehme, which is also heterodox. And wisdom is personified as a female in Proverbs and then identified as the logos, the second person of the Godhead in John. So it's an analogy. It doesn't mean that God is literally a woman or that the logos is a woman or that there's some other person in the Trinity known as Sophia or this quasi-Trinitarian This is all Hermeticism, right? So when you see the Hermetic philosophy, you can see that Bulgakov is just regurgitating Hermetic philosophy. So Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry are becoming very popular also at the time of Hegel's academic career. Three works modestly proposed the general reformation of the entire world. The Rosicrucian Manifesto centered around the legendary figure of Christian Rosenkreuz, who was supposed to have been born in 1378 and taught the Hermetic arts by the Arabs and then died in 1484. The Rosicrucian writings contain, in the words of scholar Antoine Favre, traces of Kabbalah, Pythagoreanism, and Paracelsusm. The Rosicrucian manifestos then would influence Hegel, I presume, at his when he was an academic. Hegelian philosophy also is similar to Freemasonic philosophy because, as I showed, I think I put this up on Twitter several months ago. If you look at Albert Pike's account of what the Trinity and the generation of the Son is, it's the same as these Hermetic ones. And I found this by going and reading the entire chapter that Albert Pike has on the Church Fathers. Believe it or not, Albert Pike has a chapter on the Church Fathers in Morals and Dogma. And the amazing thing that I did not expect was Pike's conclusion at the end of that chapter is that Origen and Neoplatonism are the true Christianity. Isn't that wild? Let me see if I can find that. Dang it, it never comes up when I want it. Used to, you could search, maybe I should search X. No, it's not going to come up. Used to, you could search, oh, here it is. Huh, amazing. Yeah, it came up. And I'll reshare this on Twitter in case people want to go see it. But so this is Morals and Dogma of Albert Pike, kind of summarizing. It's like the systematic theology or systematic philosophy of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And I'm just showing that it says and it aligns with what we've been reading so far in these treatises to show a commonality between Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, which Albert Pike tries to synthesize all these, right? And he says that the true Christianity is a generic first cause, and he makes an Aristotelian argument there, of a necessary creation from the one of Plato that is an emanation. And then he says, so the eternal world is necessary because God is an eternal creator. He makes Origen's argument. This is Albert Pike, Morals and Dogma, page 575. And as the thought of the soul emanating from the soul becomes audible and visible in words, so did the thought of God, the Logos, springing up within himself, immortal as himself, when once he conceived, immortal before, because in himself, utter in himself was the Word, the Logos. Its manifestation and mode of communication thus create material, mental, spiritual universe, which, like him, never began to exist. The world is an eternal emanation that is synonymous with the eternal begetting of the Son. This is the real idea of the ancient nations. Generic God, the Almighty Father and the source of all, and his thought, conceiving the universe and willing its creation, because it is just as necessary as his essence. That is a modal collapse argument in Albert Pike, the same argument that Origen makes for eternal worlds. Because if God is eternal God, an eternal Father, an eternal Creator, there must be eternal world of which he is provident Lord and Creator. And that world is the Son or the Logos. So you have the collapsing of the persons of the Godhead into the immanent process of the world. God is world process. The Logos is the world historical world process. Exactly what Hegel says. So I don't know for sure if Hegel was in some lodge. If he was, it'll be in Terry Melanson's excellent book, which is, I think, is to date probably the most scholarly work on the 17th century Bavarian Illuminati. So if you don't have Perfectibilis, it's by my publisher. I recommend getting Perfectibilis. I don't have the text with me, so I can't remember or look up if Hegel was in it. But I know that the King of Prussia was a Freemason. And many of the circles of the Prussian elite were totally involved in the philosophy of the Lodge, which, as you can see from Pike, is essentially a kind of Origenism / pantheism / Neoplatonism. So now that we come up to Hegel, we can understand, as you see here, Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy. He gives quite a space here to Heraclitus. I'm not going to reread all this because a lot of this is what you heard me explain about Heraclitus. But why am I showing you this? Well, which website has this? Did you happen to see which website this was? Marxist.org. Interesting. So Marxist.org understands that there's a crucial importance of Hegelianism to Marxist thought and philosophy. So this is for the not so smart Marxists out there, the street level basement dwelling Marxists. All right, so by the way, did you know, we'll get to this in a little bit, but you've heard of Marx's satanic poems, right? And every year somebody tells me, have you read Marx? And say, like, you need to read this book. I've read this book. I read this book 15 years ago. So yeah, I'm very familiar with Marx and Satan by Richard Wurmbrand. And he goes through the kind of the darker side of Marxism, the early satanic poetry of Marxism. If you've not read Wurmbrand's book, I do recommend it. Again, I read it 15 years ago. There's no need to tell me about these texts. I'm very familiar with them. But thank you for the super chats. If you want to support the show via super chats, you can do so right here. These are just little tidbits, by the way. So let's go to the influences on Marx, and we'll be looking at Fire in the Minds of Men, which is this great book here. Origins of the Revolutionary Faith by James H. Billington. As we said, not a conspiracy text, but rather a history of ideas text. So it's crucial for the history of revolutionary movements, their origin, their influences, and it's not an anti-revolutionary text. Billington is a believer in and a fan of the revolutionary philosophy. So the first thing we want to look at is the early chapters where he discusses what you've probably heard me talk about in the Fourth Hour, Lord Voldemort, which is the influences on the French Revolution. One of the first figures was the apostle of the revolutionary religion coming out of Italy early on, was the figure of Buonarroti. So if you don't know, Buonarroti is kind of the proto, he's the John the Baptist, you could say, to the revolutionary movements of this period. And then we move on to the milieu of Freemasonry. So notice Freemasonry is not antithetical. It is revolutionary philosophy. And it is revolutionary for both the fake right wing and the fake left wing right here. So here's Billington's section on Freemasonry. You can see that it's, again, this is from a famous historian, not a conspiracy theorist. Billington points out that Buonarroti's revolutionary organization went far beyond the Masonic models. It was influenced by his 5-year immersion in the Masonic meetings that he spent in Geneva. So great was the general impact of Freemasonry on the revolutionary era that some understanding of the Masonic milieu is essential. Masonry imparted to the revolutionary tradition at its birth the essential metaphor that revolutions were to understand their own mission down to the mid-19th century. The architect building a new and better structure for human society. Masons believed or were taught that they were recreating in their fraternal societies the original state of nature, the original natural condition that supposedly prevailed amongst the earlier artisan masons who shaped stones for a common building. The progression of each brother through the stages of an apprentice to the journeyman to the master required philosophical and philanthropic accomplishment rather than social status. Free and accepted masonry was thus a moral meritocracy, implicitly subversive with any static society based on a traditional aristocracy, nobility, monarchy, church, or hierarchy. Men of intelligence and ambition in the 18th century often experienced within the Masonic lodges a kind of brotherhood amongst equals, not found in aristocratic hierarchical societies. Each novice in the lodge sought to become free and perfect as a man, and the Mason thus capable of reading the plans of the divine architect to rebuild Solomon's temple. What is the rebuilding of Solomon's temple? It is the erecting of the proper orchestrated society. So it's a social revolutionary movement. Masonry was interested in rebuilding and reshaping the secular order. So when they talk about building the Temple of Solomon, they're talking about secular social order. Masonry's ritualized fraternity provided the upward mobility for many of those who were gentry or wealthy that were not part of the older aristocracy. It also promised for many the serious possibility of a utopia, at least a social alternative to the Ancien regime. That's what you call the older French monarchy. Philip of Orleans was the titular head of French Grand Orient Masonry at the time of the French Revolution, and most of the pro-revolutionary denizens of the cafes of the Palais Royal were his Masonic brothers. In other words, the French Revolution was started by all of the circles of the Duke of Orleans and his lodge buddies of the Grand Orient. The cafes and the salons, this is where all the revolutionaries would hang out, drinking coffee and figuring out how to destroy society. But it's destroying society to fix it, you see, to set up the equalitarian society. What's the egalitarian society? Liberty, equality, fraternity. Do you know about the Declaration of the Rights of Man? The Declaration of the Rights of Man is a Freemasonic document of this time period of the revolutionaries. And it even includes the all-seeing eye of Providence, which is not a divine, not a personal God. It's just the process philosophy. Do you see that? Declaration of the Rights of Man, French Revolutionary document, giant all-seeing eye, because Freemasonic lodges were behind both the American and French revolutions. And there she is with her chunky, milky boobies hanging out. Lady Liberty, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity. Have you heard of this anywhere recently? Liberty, equality, fraternity. I wonder what that comes from. I wonder what it means. Oh, it means all men are equal. All men and women are equal. Radical egalitarianism. Well, that's the left-wing revolutionary philosophy. That's the philosophy of the Jacobins and the Illuminists. And that's what we're reading about right now, as Billington goes on to explain that radical egalitarianism was the operating philosophy of these people. Now, I thought we were scientific. I thought we were scientifically studying nature to produce the scientific philosophy of history and determinism known as Marxism. Well, but wait a minute. Does nature actually teach that everybody's equal? Pretty sure that we're not all equal. And how far do you take that equality? Because I see today's society, which is thoroughly revolutionary, arguing that everything is equal. There are no boundaries. There are no distinctions. And so we start to see the pattern emerging that actually this philosophy gives way to an anti-natural philosophy, that distinctions are the problem. Distinctions between nations. Nations are bourgeois. Ethnicities, a made-up distinction. Biology, made-up distinction. All distinctions must be collapsed to bring in what Huxley calls the final revolution. All of these revolutions are not to no end or to no purpose. They're what Huxley calls the final revolution. And that is the revolution against man himself. Again, people who were anti-human. People like Dzerzhinsky. Revolutionary philosophers who are negating the negations and negating man himself. But he explicitly points out that it is an Illuminist model of radical egalitarianism that's fomenting and bubbling in the Masonic societies that is not purely from the ground up. It is run by the Duke of Orleans. The lesser nobility are running this. And they're getting money from somewhere. I wonder where. Well, it quickly tells us where they're getting money for the revolutions. Do you think that it just came out of nowhere? All these grody, greasy street people, Danton type people, demagogues. You think they didn't have any money? How did they have the revolution? Well, they emptied the jail. That giant, forget the name of it, that giant jail, they emptied out all the people and said, hey, join us in a bloody revolution. And it's all a bunch of criminals. Oh yeah, exactly. That's what they're going to do. That's what they're doing now. The same revolutionary model. It's elites behind this, just like the Duke of Orleans, who ran Orient Freemasonry, who got money from very wealthy families. Let's open up the jails. There's our revolutionary force. A giant criminal thug class. And that's literally who then beheaded all the elites in France. Freemasonry provided the general milieu and symbolic vocabulary for a revolution organization, it was the Illuminists that provided the basic structural model. The organizational plan of Buonarroti distilled 2 decades of revolutionary experience in Geneva and thus into a simple Bavarian order of Illuminists. The radical secular occult movement, notice that's not a contradiction, radical secular occult movement, was organized on 3 levels of a secret hierarchy. church, synod, and Areopagite. Buonarroti's revolutionary version of this structure defined the new church. It's an atheistic cell church of local cells headed by what they called a sage, who was alone linked with a regional synod. So basically an altar church. It's a secret church. The members of each synod were the sublime elect, headed by a territorial deacon, who supervised the activities of all the, quote, churches in the region. The highest Areopagite grade was called the Great Firmament, or the heavens, sent out its own subtle deacons to control the synods and supervise propaganda and agitprop. Agitprop, arising from Illuminist figures like Buonarroti. Now, this is another thing to understand, that when you are debating with a Marxist, again, you are not actually debating with a person who is interested in coming to truth. Now, there might be an individual Marxist who doesn't know this kind of stuff, who maybe at an individual level, he genuinely wants to learn or know some truth. But Marxists in general do not operate from the vantage point of wanting to come to and discover truth. In fact, Saul Alinsky, I believe, says that embracing contradictions is the necessary process of an agent, right? Of an activist. An activist truly engaging in praxis, Alinsky says, accepts and embraces contradictions. So again, you will never get consistency and coherency in a system which embraces and rejects logic. Or embraces logic and then rejects it by accepting contradictions. And again, agitprop is another one of their key techniques, because agitprop is sort of street theater, agitation, and it's a form of propaganda. So for many Marxists, debating is not arriving at truth or proving your position. Debating is intentional conflict, causing emotions, causing drama, everything that you saw the last 3 days on Twitter with these lunatics and unstable people. They're engaging in agitprop because that's what their philosophy tells them to do. And for the early Bolsheviks, for example, for agitprop, the term originates in the Soviet Union, but Marxists were doing this for a long time. They would use popular media, plays, literature, pamphlets, and other forms of art to just simply push their message. Had nothing to do with what was true or false, right? So it was all just propaganda. And it even used street theater. Agitprop theater arose as a politicized theater in the 1920s of Europe to spread to the United States. The plays of Bertolt Brecht are notable examples. By the way, I've read Bertolt Brecht's plays. I had a whole class on German playwrights, and I read one or two of Bertolt Brecht. And so he was a Marxist, I guess, who was a believer in engaging in this kind of agitprop, right? So you can see that the street theater has nothing to do. Obviously, street theater has nothing to do with truth, right? It's just about being a provocateur. So it does overlap with provocateurs. Not every agitprop is run by an agent provocateur, but every agent provocateur most likely engages in agitprop. Agitation, propaganda. Agitate to just call attention. Nothing to do with what's true. And by the way, this is not exclusive to Marxists. Basically, all of mainstream mass media is agitprop. Okay, so this is not just Marxists, but Marxists are committed to this as actually part of their praxis. Okay, but you can begin to see how, because they embrace contradictions, they embrace dissociation. They embrace double mind and double think. This is what Orwell talks about. Orwell talks about that this embracing of contradictions, which Winston tries to force, and eventually does force Winston to do, causes a split, a break in Winston's mind. And you remember when that lunatic guy came on the stream, he said, I'm here to destroy your mind. I'm here to psychologically destroy you. Because that's how the Marxist sees his necessary action of negating the existing reality to further the dialectic. So they have a mystical religious commitment to process philosophy and destruction as a form of creative chaos. Creative destruction is a Marxist idea. This, by the way, is why ultimately this whole nonsense satanic system is called by Father Seraphim Rose revolutionary nihilism. And he's absolutely right. And if you remember in the first few pages of the book, he talks about the processes of revolution. A lot of the lower level dupes believe that the revolution is about idealism and making people, feeding people and making their lives better. No, it's not about that at all. Again, this whole system is only for dupes and some of the more intellectual people who become kind of the high priests of Marxism. They kind of learn the reality of it, like Christian Rakovsky. Rakovsky was actually a high level, right, initiate of all this. And when you read the interrogation, he lays it all out and he's like, yeah, we embrace the opposites. Marxism needs capitalism. Capitalism needs Marxism. And that clash of the 20th century must happen, and it will eventually give rise to a total world government. That is the end goal, he says. And he says, you think that I'm told what to do out of Moscow? No, he's being interrogated by Moscow. He says, I'm told what to do out of New York and London. Nihilism, Roots of the Revolution of the Modern Age by Father Seraphim Rose, perfectly encapsulates and presuppositionally deconstructs and refutes all of what you've heard in the last few days of these lunatics and their nihilistic, destructive philosophy. And so you can see why, just as in the French Revolution, Marxism appeals to not just young, naive people. It appeals to fanatics, to people who believe that they can change all of society, right? So very divorced from reality notions. The idea that you can instantiate and create this quasi-utopian or something akin to a utopian society. I mean, the only person who could believe that is an extremely idealistic young person or a later delusional fanatic person as they get older. Right. And by the way, Billington's comments on fascism are also good because he explains that, guess what? It may not be identical to this, but it's the same people and it's the same socialist ideology. Right. It's National Socialism versus International Socialism. But they're both the same socialist philosophies in principle, because if you read the Rakovsky interrogation, he says, we need Tiny Mustache Man to engage in the war. The wars of the 20th century are the dialectical process. War is the preeminent dialectic. Cold War is dialectic. And this is why there's another good book on this. And you probably wouldn't expect me to recommend this person. But this is actually a pretty good book. Old Gary North. Remember Gary North? Marx's Religion of Revolution. Gary North is actually correct in this. He gives a different account than what you typically hear about Marxism, where North correctly argues, as I'm arguing today, that Marxism is akin to a religion. Far from being a scientific theory and a scientific appraisal of the determining processes of history. That's what it claims to be. Marxism is actually a revolutionary religion because it promises people many things to believe in for the future. So not only does Marxism, which bare atheistic scientism doesn't have. Here's the great thing about why Marxism has such an appeal. I think Gary North is spot on about this. I don't agree with a lot of Gary North, obviously being a Calvinist, Reconstructionist guy, but they still, Rushdoony and North got some things right, and North got this point right, that Marxism is a type of religion with a high priesthood, with mystical doctrines of material process and so forth, dogmas. And pseudoscience And so it promises at the outer portico lower dupe levels to many people utopia. Now, the smarter Marxists will say,
Well, Marx never actually said there would be a dystopia. He talked about the possibility. It's not actually.
yeah, we know. We know that in the inner party, in the inner religion, it's not really utopian, and it's actually nihilistic and anti-human. I know all that. But for many people, for many of the masses that believed in it, they thought, oh, yeah, we're going to get, a chicken in every pot. We're going to get, better living standards, and the government loves us, and it's going to divvy up the capital, right? The capitalists have hoarded the capital, and if we just appoint a body of Marxists, they'll dole it out equally to everybody because they're fair and they're nice people and they love us. That's the normie belief. The dum-dums that believe in the system, they believe in a kind of eschatological hope, not of an end times, but a material historical process that will provide man material gains, sufficiency, and safety, supposedly, in a near future history. So it has an eschatology, is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't just have an eschatology, it also has a philosophy of history. History is the dynamic interchange of class warfare, which is a manifestation of the dialectic. So most of the time when Marxists hear dialectic, the classic Marxists, they think of class warfare. I am not talking about that when I'm talking about dialectics primarily. I am talking about the metaphysical presuppositions of all forms of dialectics, whether it be dialectical idealism in Hegel or dialectical materialism in Marx. Those are metaphysical beliefs. That's what I'm talking about. And so Gary North has a great deconstruction and critique of how the belief, the mystical religious belief, is literally in creative destruction, regeneration through chaos, as North calls it. And he's absolutely correct. So back to the Illuminists and the Illuminist model of Billington. They were engaging in agitprop. And he goes on to say that the Order of Illuminists was founded in May 1st, 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, the professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria. Weishaupt had 4 associates. The order was secret, hierarchical, and modeled on the Jesuits. Now, there's a bunch of dum-dums that think that means that Jesuits run the Illuminati. No. Jesuits don't run the Illuminati. The structure is modeled on the Jesuits. Jamie? It's okay. The order was secret. It itself was hierarchical. Wait a minute. I thought we believed in liberty, equality, fraternity. Why do we have morals and dogma if we believe in freedom of conscience and no dogmas? Why do we believe in a hierarchy in Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati if he believes in radical egalitarianism? Oh, you see, they embrace contradictions, dummies. They are liars. That's why. The order was secret. It was established and modeled on the Jesuits. It had a long domination in Bavarian education, and it ended with their abolition by the papacy, supposedly in 1773. It was dedicated to Weishaupt's Rousseauian philosophy. So Rousseau is a key figure. It's not identical to Rousseau because there were a lot of elements that Rousseau believed in that like Rousseau didn't. I don't think he had a high view of women. Right? He was always visiting the prostitutes as he was writing about equality. Right? There's some other things that Rousseau talked about, right? That I don't think but the idea of returning to this pure state of nature or something like that. You find some of that in Weishaupt. The vision of leading all humans to a new moral perfection. So moral perfection, you don't need church and religion. You can achieve this naturally through purely naturalistic processes. Thus, they were freed from all establishment religion and establishment political authority. So no authority but myself. Weishaupt did not invite intellectuals to join his new pedagogic elite so much as taunted them to do so. He radiated contempt for men from the Enlightenment who go into all kinds of ecstasies over antiquity, but are themselves unable to do anything. So Weishaupt actually disagreed with and hated the idea of philosophical speculation and let's read Plato and the Greeks. And he's saying, which Marx will echo, why aren't you engaging in revolutionary action, you see? He insisted that what was missing is the force and to put into practice what has long been affirmed by free thinkers. The force was to come about through a new type of secret society. This secret society would have much more in the characteristics of a militia with an order with initiations into higher levels. The purpose of the ascending of the Illuminist hierarchy was not so much to attain wisdom as it was to be remade into a totally loyal servant of the universal mission of revolution. So it's the religion of revolution. It's the faith, revolutionary faith. These guys were perceptive enough in human psychology to understand that humans are fundamentally religious. And so they could turn the atheism, which was empty and bereft of any meaning that was popular at this time, turn it into a religion which could motivate and push and take society in a certain direction, so they thought, to remodel the entire world. We cannot use people as they are. We have to make them over, to change them. That's the process of the initiation in his secret society. Weishaupt helped to elaborate a process of recruitment which involved creating the novices of a psychological dependence on the processes which would transform him. Insinuators, those brought about as new members, were proceeded little by little following the detours. So in other words, there's deception at the lower ranks, exactly what Albert Pike says, that the lower level people in the Blue Lodges are duped, they're dummies, and you're gradually brought into this structure to become totally devoted to the structure, basically a form of mind control. The object was the card pledging a new member and his desire for admission to the higher levels. So you want to be higher, you want to get to the higher levels, this lust for power, but really you're just being sifted and vetted, basically. The nerve-wracking process sought to mobilize a new elite within society, and their purpose was, quote, not to conquer or to impose, not to gather riches, but to the conquest of individuals, to conquer their indifference, their passiveness, their obedient submission, their total confidence without reservation must be gained. So the goal wasn't even to immediately achieve this, but to create a society of people completely devoted to the cause. The revolutionaries' primitive vision of the world was a dualistic struggle between darkness and light, a neo-Manichaean view. Did you hear me? Dialectics, dialectical process. The world was engaged in a struggle between the illuminated ones and the sons of darkness. The illuminated ones were those in the order of the perfectibilis, or the perfect, the perfecti, versus those outside of the order who were profane and believed in the system and in the structure. The name of the Illuminists was chosen from the image of the sun radiating illumination in outer circles. So the sun is at the center of the dot, and then there's concentric circles around the sun, and that's the structure of the Illuminati. The point in the circle, that's Weishaupt and his elite, and you have these concentric circles. The Zoroastrian Manichaean cult of fire was also central to the eclectic symbolism of the Illuminists. Their calendar was based on the Persian rather than the classical Christian model. They used pseudonyms and symbols which made for precise esoteric significance throughout the lodges, the Masonic lodges which they infiltrated. They became deliberate instruments of camouflage for Illuminists. Ingolstadt was Eleusis and Ephesus. Munich was Athens. Vienna was Rome. Weishaupt's own name in his Illuminist secret society was that of Spartacus, Spartacus Weishaupt. That's because Spartacus was the leader of the slave revolt in ancient Rome, and this provided a hint of revolutionary commitment. In the original key documents, collaborators took the names of the Greek Ajax or the Egyptian Danaus, and respectively other names such as Tamerlane and Confucius. The Illuminists attempted to use the ferment of the confusion of the French Revolution for their own ends. Weishaupt, for example, joined a Masonic lodge in 1777 in an attempt to recruit from them his own commandos. Later, other famous elite figures like Baron Adolf von Knigge, Knigge, was a prominent member of the Illuminists and other higher German Masonic orders. The Illuminist technique was to discredit all conservative rival orders and then bring them into a stricter secret order. This is an important section here. This helped helping the Conference of Occult Orders at Wilhelmsbad in 1782 helped to determine the strict observance lodges were not in fact descended from the Knights Templar, and Fowl arguing that the strict order of the lodges were secretly controlled by unknown superiors who were Jesuits. So basically, Weishaupt comes up with a lie that the existing lodges were controlled by the Jesuits, and so you need to join my lodge, which is the true Masonry. So it wasn't true that the Jesuits were controlling the Masonic lodges, but Weishaupt used that as a way to get people into his group. Weishaupt believed in total equality, so that was a big part of his church and what they pushed. One of the key figures to disseminate Illuminism was Count Mirabeau's The Prussian Monarchy under Frederick the Great. Now, that's important because this is around the time, so this will be the grounds from which Hegel will be born. Okay, this is pre-Hegel, but I'm saying Hegel will come out of this milieu. Another key figure is Nicholas Bonneville, the decisive channel of Illuminist influence. He was converted to Illuminism through his own visits to Persia in 1787. Weishaupt's leading associate in the political stage of communism was a guy named Christian Bode. Bode was a friend of Lessing who had come to win Frenchmen away from their conservative occultism and to get them into a more radical form of Illuminism. Bode apparently converted the German-speaking Bonneville, who was then a lawyer at Parliament, to a faith that combined Illuminist symbolism and radical ideas of popular sovereignty, vox populi sovereignty. Bonneville immediately began his unsuccessful attempt to convert the Marquis de Condorcet, who was a revolutionary, to a more active faith, hailing the imminent coming of the People King. There would be a liberating figure, the flame of the world, they called him, the sage of Rousseau, known as the People King. So we have this messianic prophecy of this coming People King. However, the group was run not by an external, it was not an egalitarian society, it was actually run by an inner party, the inner group, known as the Inner Circle. The conspirators have viewed Maréchal as the center of the circle. He may have been, this is unsure, but certainly many people around the circle of Weishaupt, of the inner Areopagites, were part of that, of the inner clique. The goal of the society was, in terms of social order, happy equality. Sounds like John Locke. Sounds like Declaration of Independence. If there was a religion that was allowed, the religion of Weishaupt and Mirabeau would be a purely naturalized religion. Everything would be done by voting, and there would be universal suffrage. Everyone would vote. Interesting. So, women's suffrage comes from Adam Weishaupt. In fact, the final goal is, of all the radicals, universal communism. Did you hear me? No. Weishaupt saw himself, whether or not Buonarroti was in effect propagating an Illuminist program during his revolutionary activities of the 1790s, he had clearly internalized a lot of the Illuminist ideas. They would become a blueprint for the 1810 to 1811 era, and the Illuminist pretension of recovering a natural religion known only to the illuminated. So you see that the naturalized religion is the inner party's core religion that they think all the world religions are kind of a bastardization of. A religion of, quote, pure reason. A religion, pure reason. By reviving the legacy of bizarre genealogy, the Persians of Cyrus, the initiators of Egypt and the Egyptian priests, the Holy Hermandad of Spain, and the apostolate of Jesus, they view Jesus as a revolutionary. The Anabaptists and their revolution, as well as the Jesuits. He followed Weishaupt and Bonneville in attaching special importance to the Jesuits, whom he sought both to imitate and to destroy. His secret ideal was from the beginning, to Buonarroti, the egalitarian equality order that would get rid of all marks of private property. In the Republic will be the sole owner. The Republic will be like a mother. It will afford each of its members equality of education, equality of food, equality of labor. This is Buonarroti saying that the state will own all things and your children. You will own nothing, you will have nothing, you will be happy. This is the only regeneration aimed at by the philosophers. This is the new Jerusalem. Quote, Buonarroti. These quotes, Buonarroti borrowed from Illuminism. For these secret societies, then, the adopting of numerology and cryptography were not actually about mystical initiations of supernatural knowledge. They were not about contacting demons or invoking or evoking them. These were ciphers and codes used for transmitting messages and for espionage, as I have said for years. What is the Illuminist ideal? According to them, the magic circle refers not to actual magic, but the inner circle of the controlling elite who control the system and the society. Bonneville, even before the revolution, had traced his ideals to Pythagoras, who brought from the Orient, from the East, the true system of initiation into the Eastern ways. At the demise of his effort to square the social circle meant to create or to understand that man is God and that man will become an angel by widening the circle of universal brotherhood. In other words, universal brotherhood, universal communism. Thomas Paine, who lived with Bonneville from 1797 to 1802, believed that the Druids and Pythagoras combined to provide an actual occult ideological alternative to Christianity. Thus, Thomas Paine wrote an essay on the origins of Freemasonry. And how many so-called conservatives tout Thomas Paine, who literally says that Druidism is a better alternative to Christianity? In fact, the goal of the Pythagoreans, the revolutionaries, not the original Pythagoras, was, quote, to overthrow Christian orthodoxy. There you go. In fact, the goal was to decapitate the double-headed eagle. They particularly hated Orthodox Christianity, page 105. And so to decapitate the double-headed eagle, which stood for church and state, bishop and king, church and state, to decapitate the double-headed eagle meant to destroy throne and altar, church and state. So understand, all of these people telling you that dialectical Marxism is compatible with Christian orthodoxy are absolutely 100% wrong. And they're ignorant or they're lying. Because the goal of historic revolutionary philosophy from the 1700s on is the destruction of throne and altar and the imposition of a new religion based around nature, controlled by a one world state. That is present in Weishaupt all the way up into the later centuries. In fact, the Saint Simonians are going to be the next group that we're going to look at. And we're going to look at how the Simonians were one of the key influences on Marx, right? Who were the three? Feuerbach, Saint Simon, and Hegel. The key influences on Marx. We're going to look at that in part 2. this is the first half for public. If you enjoyed this discussion, please leave me a super chat. I'll be reading a few of those right now. And one thing I'd like to mention is the contrast between what you get in the Marxists and what they offer you, joining a revolutionary, ideological, ridiculous AstroTurf movement that you will regret by the time that you're out of your 20s or your 30s that you ever were involved in it or believed it, versus the kind of thing that we promote, which is teaching you to be your own business leader, teaching you to be independent, how to be truly masculine, how to run a business, how to have a family, how to do these kinds of things. So, for example,
So you've done this.
what are we pushing? We push things that help you and won't destroy your life like Marxism will. For example, Richard over at Autonomy University, I'll give you a little bit of his thing. And by the way, people said, what's wrong with the audio? The original audio is the problem. It's not mine.
Self-help, and you've dipped into some personal development, but now you ask the question, now what? What can you do? Well, if you want to escape the apathy, step right this way. So twice a year, I teach a course called Autonomy. It's a 12-week personal development and training course. What people get out of it is multifaceted. There's curriculum, there's exercises, there's camaraderie, you make new friends. There's a whole lot of interesting things. We're going to hear a sample from the course right now, and let's take a look at the value these students are getting. Charlotte departed this world, I think 2 years ago in March. So probably about 2 years ago. She lived a long, full life. She lived up in Maine, and her website used to be deliberatedumbingdown.com, but americandeception.com was a site that she did with her son, and her son was helping her research. And americandeception.com is where a lot of the source material used to be. Like the copy that we have of the Reese committee hearings is Charlotte's copy. She went and found that copy and got it and circulated it. Her work, I remember when I first encountered her work, I didn't know what to make of it because it's just too overwhelming and out of left field. And I was familiar with Gatto's work, but not as much as I could. So Gatto's work bounced off me the first time. I saw Charlotte's work. I was like, there's something here, but I don't know what it is. I did some more learning, discovered like Tragedy and Hope and Anthony Sutton's work. Then I went back to those two books. I was like, oh, these people are all talking about the same thing. She's talking about the 1934 Carnegie Blue Book, which was the internationalist text inserted into America. So the globalists are like, here's how we're going to insert into American education and turn it into our compulsory schooling and reshape it in our image. And we'll remove the history where we're at war with Britain and that everything will be just hunky-dory. And they got their way and they did it. So Charlotte was she was working in the Reagan administration back, I think in the 80s, and she came across some of this information. She was incredulous, and then she went and dug it up, and she's like, oh my goodness, they are systematically changing the attitudes, values, behaviors, and beliefs of Americans to be more in line with communists and collectivists. The removal of individual rights, basically, it's a way to erode any of America's power. What did America have? We had our ability to coin money, and we had freedom of speech, and we had all these things. Those separated us from the British Empire. So as they kind of cut those piers one by one, they can do a controlled demolition of the whole thing. And that's kind of where we're at in history right now. So we got front row seats. We're like that movie Grand Tour back in the day. It was time travelers from the future who would go to big events in the past and they would watch it. And it had like Jeff Daniels. It was an early 90s comedy. But there's something to having front seats on like the end of the world type situation. So I don't see it as a tragedy. I see it as a big opportunity, a good call to action for everybody to get on the field and start playing and stop being spectators. Because if these people think they can do this to our world without us seeing it and doing something about it, they're wrong. And we're in motion. So Charlotte, her work spans, decades and decades and decades. And that's her book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. It's a 700-page book. It's heavy duty. It's an academic quality. It uses real references and resources. It's not hyperbolized, right? But her other big contribution that very few people know about is when Charlotte's father passed away, he was in Skull and Bones. And Charlotte's grandfather used to work for Cecil Rhodes in South Africa. He was in mining, okay? So Charlotte had had conversations with her dad, but he wouldn't tell her anything. Well, between his death and her going through the attic, and then Skull and Bones sending, here's this year's, book for the members. She's like, I got this evidence and there's something here, but it's outside of her purview. She doesn't know. She's an expert on the educational part, and she knows there's something to this. She doesn't know what to do. So she calls up Anthony Sutton and says, Anthony, your books on the Bolshevik Revolution and Wall Street and all these sort of things lead me to believe you would be interested in this content. He's like, send it over. So he wrote a book called America's Secret Establishment: An Introduction to Skull and Bones. And in there was a report how the Order 322, how the Skull and Bones secret society controls education. And when you go through and compare what they're saying in their documents to what Charlotte had found from the Carnegie, there's a comprehensive plan with multiple secret societies or working groups going toward this same thing with great deal of intention and organization and budget and long-term commitment, multi-generational commitment to their goals. And we as individuals don't really relate to that because we're just like looking for the paycheck next week. So we're playing in a game that is not like checkers. It's not even like chess. It's more like Go, which is a game in Asia to conquer as much territory as fast as you can. So it's like a fast moving game, and we're still like at turtle speed. But tortoise versus the hare, I say we just go calm, cool, collected. Let's not panic. It's been going on since before we got here. It's going to go on probably after we leave here if we don't do something about it. And let's figure out what we can learn. Who left us these credible pieces of artifacts, evidence that illustrate what's going on, like Gatto, like Iserby, like Sutton, like Carol Quigley, and let's communicate. It's our.
All right, so that's a clip giving you a kind of a introduction to Richard's course, which he's going to start up pretty soon over at Autonomy University. Here's the link if you're interested in learning about retooling your education to become a self-sufficient business owner, entrepreneur, an individual who takes control of their own life and isn't submitting to and absorbed into some idiotic collective and relying on the system to do things for you. It's still not too late to become that. And in fact, the Pentagon said a few years ago that their number one enemy is motivated individuals who are active and who are out there becoming their own business owner. The very thing that Richard's talking about. That's what the Pentagon literally said, I think about 10 years ago, was the number one danger to the imposition of the Technocratic Order. Now, again, why did I think that was a great clip? Because he mentions Sutton's history of Skull and Bones, which is very crucial to the funding of both Bolshevism, Marxism, and Communism, as well as the funding of Tiny Mustache Men to create the thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis of where we are today, the coming Technocratic Order. Sutton wrote about this very thing that you're hearing me talk about, and the very thing that's talked about in Fire in the Minds of Men, the very thing that's talked about in the Milner-Fabian book by Ratieu in decades ago. So people try to discredit Sutton. It's all true. He's not discredited. Brzezinski wouldn't cite him in Between Two Ages if he was a kook and a crackpot. In fact, he laid all this out in 1983 in this History of Skull and Bones. And he talks about, throughout the book, the importance of Hegelianism to this whole system. If you don't understand Hegelianism, you cannot understand the world that we're going into, and in what way they co-opted and utilized the Hermetic philosophy of the worship of dialectical process. So there could be people in the elite, by the way, that are not Marxists. There might be ideologically Platonic, Neoplatonic elite, like Hegel. But there's also dialectical people who believe in the worship of pure matter and flux as a mystery religion that we saw earlier. Both of those are amenable to the Technocratic Order, and that's why the Technocratic Order is above. It is, in a way, the kind of synthesis already of these existing ideologies, right? Was Brzezinski anti-communist? Many people would say, of course, he fought the Cold War. Well, wait a minute. Brzezinski calls the Cold War a Manichaean dialectic. which echoes everything we've been talking about today. And Brzezinski, in fact, was not anti-socialist. He's anti-Soviet, not anti-communist or socialist. And that's why for the synthesis, now that the Soviet Union has evaporated, now they believe they will get the synthesis of what was formerly Eurasian communism versus Western capitalism or monopoly capitalism. They believe the synthesis is now emerging, the technocratic global order of Klaus and company. That is the synthesis. That is the proto-one world government that Rakovsky said would emerge out of the post-war order. So if you want to get access to that, you can sign up for Richard's course at the link right there. Richard is there in the chat. Shout out to my boy Richard. Head on over to that link, and you're going to have to complete that obstacle course, right? That's just to make sure that you're serious about this and serious about the information. It shouldn't take too long, and then you can move on to talking with somebody over there about pricing if you're interested in that. Now, my course that I taught is also very relevant, and that is the history of Western philosophy, because in the first few minutes, we dove into a little bit of pre-Socratic philosophy. We talked a little bit about how Heraclitus is crucial for Hegel. And in my full lectures, you can get access to that. We go much deeper into each of the pre-Socratic figures, deconstructing all of their system in totality. And you can get that at this link right here, which is the Autonomy Agora Marketplace. Head on over there right now and read that. Let's see. We got some super chats. Now people are asking, what about Lenin's empirical criticism? Yes, I have that pulled up. Materialism, empirio-criticism. What about objective truth? Doesn't Lenin say he believes in objective truth? We're going to get into this in the part 2 as we dive deeper into Marxism. So this is a half and half. Today's talk is the first part free. If you want the second part for paid subscribers, that will be available at the show after this goes up in a couple days. I usually make the part 2s for people a day or two after, sometimes 3 or 4 days, depending upon how busy I am. And you can get access to that by subscribing to the website at jasonellis.com or by subscribing over at Rockfin. It's another great way to get access to a lot of that material as well. Rockfin is great because it's a free speech-based platform which allows you to subscribe to everybody under the paid option. So there's a lot of free content, but everybody's paid content is accessible to everybody who subscribes to Rockfin. So head on over to Rockfin and subscribe to all of our buddies over there. We've got heavyweights, Richard Grove, best geopolitical podcast out there, bar none, at Grand Theft World right here. So head on over to that link in the show or in the chat right here. You can subscribe to Richard. But look, it's not just Richard. Look who else is over there. You've got Jimmy Dore. You've got Horvey at Geopolitics and Empire, great podcast. You've got Jamie Henshaw. You might have heard of her. You got our buddy Burmas. You've got our buddy Sam Tripoli. You've got Eddie Bravo. You've got Unlimited Hangout. You've got all kinds of people over there. Isaac Weishaupt, right? All of our buddies are over there at Rockfin as well. So be sure and subscribe to Rockfin. Keep in mind, if you want to feed your brain, Sunday is when Richard does Grand Theft World. And Grand Theft World is a feast of information. It goes for 7 hours. So you've done it. Not just this right here, but look at this. 6 hours and 52 minutes last week. Satan summons his legions, right? Don't you want access to all this? Well, head on over to Rockfin and you can get access to that and look for Grand Theft World tonight when Richard will be doing that. All right, let's go to the super chats. Now, wait a minute. What am I doing? What am I doing? I can't even think. By the way, I did find the thing I mentioned on last night's show where I was trying to think of the article about how espionage related to the Himalayas. Remember that? And I'm trying to find Mark's article on that because there's a great article on that over here at Espionage History Archive. This one is relevant too for Bolshevik occultism. So this is not the article I'm looking for, but relevant for today's discussion. Bolshevik occultism. See that right there? Great article that Mark translated. And I'll put the link here for you guys for that one. But it's not just Bolshevik occultism. What I'm looking for is there's a great story about the Tsar sending Buddhist monks as spies, and that's what everybody did at that time for that region, right? This explains Himmler's mission to the Himalayas, right? It wasn't just esoteric jibber jabber; it was also geostrategic espionage stuff, right? Hence why. Here it is, The Great Game in Tibet. Found it. This is a great article if you haven't read it. It gets into the Tsar and Tsarist espionage against the West, and why Tibet is this key region, and why the CIA had such an interest in Tibet during the Cold War, and I would argue even to today, right? Free Tibet, as we saw in last night's stream, was a CIA-funded movie, or a funded operation. And that also ties into why Tiny Mustache Man wanted to get the Dalai Lama on his side. So if you don't know about that, there's a whole history to Tiny Mustache Man trying to basically use and get that dude on his side, the Dalai Lama. All right. Gollum Go Home sends $10 and says nothing. Thank you, Gollum. 00 Honeybee, $10, says nothing. Thank you, 00 Honeybee. Shout out to our buddy AC. Glad to see him back in the chat. Glad to see him back on Twitter, even though I guess he got sick of Twitter. Shout out to AC. By the way, AC, I did bring a lot of my books when I moved that you sent me, so I do intend to get to those eventually. Ali Adonai, $4. I'm broke, but I wanted to say thank you for fighting this good fight. I appreciate all your work. Thank you. Much appreciated. Epyville, $5. Thank you so much, Epyville. Bone Man, $5.38, $5. If the Trinity is a Hegelian thesis, antithesis, synthesis, Hegel's Trinity, is contrasting the representation of objective truth, what can be said about the geometry of stars with right side up triangles overlaid with upside down triangles? Is this an anti-polarity refutation of the same? I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about, but I think you're talking about the pictures that Dr. McGee says what. So you're talking about this picture on the front, right, of the book where it's Hegel's stars. So I think, I'm not understanding your question, but I think the drawing is that Hegel believes that thesis, antithesis, synthesis is constantly producing the movement of all reality to pure spirit. So as the dialectic transpires throughout all history and every action within history is part of the dialectical process, this is the thesis, antithesis, synthesis move. Everything, every event is moving in that direction. And eventually all of the triangles will coalesce into the pure synthesis of pure spirit, when all reality will be pure spirit. That's Hegel's mystical monistic metaphysic there. So that's what I think the symbols mean here. I don't know what all his little stars mean. I mean, the circle is that's the Weishaupt dot, right? That's the monad, the circle and the dot. But as to what every little symbol is meant there by Hegel, I don't know. I think it's just trying to encapsulate polarities, male and female, right? That achieves the synthesis of the child. I think that's what is probably meant by the drawing. Storm the Cat, $10. Do you think there's an esoteric Platonic symbolism in Halo with the rings in space and the Covenant's great journey? I haven't played Halo since I was in my 20s, so I don't really remember a lot of the storyline. I know they have like a religious covenant, and there's heretics and stuff like that. So it certainly borrows from probably Christian ideology and symbolism, but I don't know if it borrows anything directly from Platonism. Doth 4580, $10. Can you flesh out more specifically the context of Lenin's writings, why he's contradicting the case of objectivity in the rest of his views? Yeah, that's going to relate to what we're going to talk about in hour 2. because here is the chapter in chapter 4 of the book where he talks about objective truth. And I'm going to argue that when he gets down to what he defines as pure sensation, the gospel is sense data. None of this proves the thesis that he has. So he understands that crude materialism is self-refuting and silly, right? He talks about Ernst Mach and people like this, right? But his answer, his solution is not enough. It doesn't work, given that he's also a material. He's in the same box. All materialists are in the same box. So that's my critique. But we're going to get into more of that in part 2 when we analyze this chapter from Lenin. But thank you for that super chat. Bon Jovi 1912, $50. Thank you, Bon Jovi. That's a cool name. Biggest super chat winner of the night. Again, if you want the full show, head on over to my website or to my Rockfin and subscribe for paywall access to the full talk in the next couple of days. Appreciate those super chats. And also want to remind you that we have the show sponsor, Chalk.com. If you want to get access to the best supplements out there, you want to head on over to Chalk. Chalk is the best red pill based company when it comes to supplementation, to getting your health squared away. And there's no better way to do that than through Chalk.com. Chalk offers the best adaptogens. I don't know why my internet's frozen. It's not coming up for some reason. But it's choq.com, and if you go to the show description, you'll see the links there for Chalk. You can get access to the Shilajit. You can get access to the... let me pull it up this way. Yep. Be sure and get it from Chalk.com, though, because you get a great discount. If you head on over to Chalk.com, there's the daily. You'll see that they have a variety of options there. Daily is great for nutrient deficiency, great for overall supplementation. It does help boost testosterone. Daily is the only product, by the way, that they have that is just for men. All the other products are for men or women. Daily, however, is just for men, and it does help with boosting testosterone. I also recommend especially the Tongkat Ali. The Tongkat Ali is probably the best when it comes to absolutely boosting testosterone. That's the male vitality stack. So if you head on over to Chalk.com right now, you can knock off about half of that cost right there with 50% off by using the promo code J50. That's JAY50. And if you want to set up recurring subscriptions, you can do that through using the promo code J53Life. That's J53LIFE. And check out that male vitality stack. They also have female vitality stacks as well. So it's also good for regulating hormones, for balancing out, basically calming you down if you're one of those ladies that has to deal with hormone imbalances, or you want mental focus and clarity. This is a great bundle right here for ladies, the ashwagandha, the shilajit, and the Irish moss. Jamie takes these all the time. She's a big fan of those. So head on over to Chalk.com, use the promo code J50 or the promo code J53Life to get 53% off all recurring subscriptions. Guess what? I've also got awesome, cool news. Our next book club book with our buddy Frank. Remember how we did Brave New World? We did every chapter with Frank in Brave New World. Remember that? It was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun. You can get access to that full 5-hour course that Frank and I did. It's basically a literary course through Brave New World over at my members section. I think Frank has it also. Next up, Monday night, it starts. Me and Frank. Guess what we're doing? Book club.
Why you bring this to me? Why you bring this to me now? Why you want to bring this to me now?
We're going to do it. We're doing it. You got it. Since I've been having so many great discussions with Sammy the Bull Gravano, the most famous living gangster today. Great book, Mafia Dynasty, I've been reading by John Davis. Gets into the history of the Gambinos all the way up to entire chapters about Sammy the Bull. What better book for Frank and I to do than The Godfather? Of course, everybody I'm sure has seen the movie. However, it is an amazing literary achievement as a book. So look for that Monday night. Frank and I will be doing the first 4 chapters. So if you want to join us, I think that's Frank's member section, but it will also be available to my members section as well. So otherwise, everybody have a great Sunday. And also check out Richard's show tonight, Grand Theft World.